I've always preferred Need for Speed from the 90s over modern Need for Speed. I think it might have something to do with the fact that there are certain criteria that I feel a Need for Speed game has to have in order for me to be emotionally and intellectually invested. Number one, the racing needs to be fun. Number two, there has to be a split screen multiplayer because dang it, couch gaming has always been more fulfilling being spent with people you know and love as opposed to playing online with a bunch of faceless nobodies that you have no emotional attachment with. And finally, number three, the cars need to be exotic. I mean, the idea of starting a racing campaign with a Ford Focus or Volkswagen Golf may seem totally normal to most people nowadays, but to me, I still think one of the biggest appeals of Need for Speed is driving like a maniac in a car that costs more than your entire life savings. A fantasy you cannot experience in the real world because, when I started Need for Speed Underground with a Honda Civic, I actually had a literal Honda Civic in my driveway. And I drove that thing to college every day. For me, that's not Need for Speed. It's a little too pedestrian and a bit boring, in my opinion. So what game had all three of these aspects? Basically everything from the 90s and almost nothing after that. After all these years, I still prefer Need for Speed 3 over anything that has come out in the past 20 years. Call me out of touch or old-fashioned, I don't care. However, as a veteran of Need for Speed 3, Hot Pursuit for the PC, I cannot believe I'm going to say this, but you guys are kind of playing the game wrong. Brush me off as a pretentious elitist, but seriously, Need for Speed 3 Hot Pursuit would be more universally accepted as being at least one of the best racing games of all time if people would just take a few seconds to tweak a few things. Every time I see a video of Need for Speed 3, it just looks like garbage compared to what I experienced on my PC back in the year 2000. And so, this video is going to cover how to get this game to work not just on a modern PC, but also to set up some things that people really need to do before even starting a single race. Now, I know most of you don't have a CRT to make the game look even better than it does on any LCD display, but if you have a high refresh rate monitor, then definitely take advantage of that. Because even though 60 frames a second is the standard for most displays, going above 60 Hz would actually get better results. Not because of this elitist, more frames equals better gameplay. The reason is simply because the game stutters at a low frame rate. The game was built for high frame rates between 75 Hz to 120 Hz. In my personal experience, I found 100 Hz to be the sweet spot where the frame times are extremely even and it looks so fluid. But if you cannot do that, that's understandable. However, there are many other things that are totally within your control, even if you're playing on a cheap laptop or whatever. Step number one, let's get the modern annoyances out the way. In the past, I used to use a patch called the Need for Speed 3 Vista patch, which worked perfectly with Windows 7, but alas, not so on Windows 10 and probably not on Windows 11. So there is another fan-made patch to get the game to work on a modern system, even though there are some things I prefer about the Vista patch. So if anyone happens to be running an older machine with Vista, Windows 7, or surprisingly even XP, I would actually recommend the Vista patch, but more on that later. For now, let's very briefly run through the modern patch. It's really easy. Just do a search for modern patch for Need for Speed 3, and you will most likely find exactly what we need. But to save time, I'll just put a link to it in the description below. After downloading, unzip everything, copy the contents of the zip file to your base Need for Speed 3 folder on your main drive, which means you would have to have installed the game already. Just let it overwrite any old files that it replaces, and now you can start up the game. The patch, in its current form, as of this recording, is a bit buggy, which is why I prefer the Vista patch. Although in hindsight, getting the game to run on the Vista patch was a bit more involved. Sure, it had a nice and easy to use installer, but for those that plan on experimenting with the Vista patch, you'll need to download the official Need for Speed 3 Voodoo DLL graphics files. if your copy of the game doesn't already have them included. Just do a Google search, it's very easy to find. The reason for this is because we're actually going to need to run it in glide mode, which means you're going to need a glide wrapper. I like nglide. It's simple to use and does everything you could ever want a glide wrapper to do. Because Need for Speed in Direct 3D mode looks weird on more modern hardware since DirectX 9 has changed a few things that would result in buggy visuals. Besides, glide mode has always looked better simply because the game was optimized for Voodoo graphics cards since it is a 3D game from 1998. But you won't need to do any of that with the modern patch as opposed to the Vista patch. No messing with the glide wrappers or DLL files, etc. Just start up the game as normal, and once you're in the main menu, select one player, single race, go to options, graphics, max out all the settings because sometimes they're not by default for whatever reason. Make sure lighting is set to projection rather than vertex if you want your headlights in night races to look pristine and, for what it's worth in the 2020s, more realistic. However, vertex is actually better if you want to see more of the track at night without straining your eyes, because apparently, according to EA from 1998, headlamps don't need to show texture detail. Let's just blast everything with a white filter. So yeah, for years, vertex has always been better. That is until I realized that reducing the lighting to 2/3 instead of full blast reduced the white filter, and in fact makes it much easier to see the lines on the road, and now it actually looks okay-ish. I mean, some of the other lighting effects is a little dimmer now, but it's still not as clear as vertex lighting. But really, in this case, either one is a good option, and it really does depend on taste. What doesn't depend on taste would be the HUD. This HUD is one of the ugliest HUDs I have ever seen in a racer. I mean, it looks more like an operating system from an Amiga 500 than a HUD in a racing game. But it turns out that it being like an operating system is actually not too far off of what it can do. Like in an operating system where you can customize the layout of your icons and menus, in this case you can adjust the tachometer, speedometer and lap counter and other important racing info. But remember when I said that this patch is a bit buggy? Well, in my case, the game keeps crashing every time I try to enter the heads-up display menu. But fortunately, this is Need for Speed 3 we're talking here. You can just make these adjustments in the game racing menu and the game won't crash. When it comes to the usual stuff like setting the metric or imperial standards, enabling the rear view mirror, etc., the thing I want to focus on is the positions menu. Here you can drag and drop each visual HUD element to places on the screen you prefer. It may look very cluttered at first, but that's just because each option that is toggled on and off, like choosing between an analog or digital speedometer, you only need to focus on the stuff that is turned on. In my case, I like to use the analog gauge cluster. Map and opponent list is disabled with only the rear mirror, laps data and leading position data enabled. It really doesn't matter what HUD elements you prefer to turn on or off. What does matter are their placements. Maybe some people like that blue bar at the top of the screen, just like how it was cool wearing jeans just above your knees. Good thing you can just remove the blue bar by dragging many of the HUD elements a little lower, not including the analog cluster and mirror, thank goodness, and it's gone. Just eyeball the rest to your liking, and now we have a HUD that isn't embarrassing anymore. Now that you've done all that, guess what? You get to do it all over again. Since the game doesn't save these options between single player and two player mode, oh, and since cops use a completely different HUD from single player, then you would have to do the same with that, which means rinse and repeat for the player 2 cop. Ugh. Oh, and might I warn you, if you were to change the game's resolution, that would then reset everything, which means you'll once again have to redo the whole lot. There have been countless times when I would have to redo the heads-up display. In the beginning, I used to meticulously line up every HUD element nicely so that it's all symmetrical and all that stuff, but it's so much work now that I just take a total asymmetrical design, and to be honest, it actually looks fine. Oh, but this doesn't just apply to the HUD, but also to the controller and key bindings. If you have a controller that has already been set up the way you like it, but forgot to plug it in the next time you start up the game, guess what? Reconnecting the controller won't bring back your customized controls. You would have to set it up again. Oh, and get this, you're gonna love this. If you plug in a second controller, your first controller's custom bindings will be reset yet again. So make sure every time you start the game that all the input devices that were plugged in before needs to all be present if you don't want to repeat these steps over and over again. Like, yikes, I'll admit, this is a massive oversight on EA's part. This is the kind of garbage I'd expect from modern EA, not 90s Electronic Arts. Oh well. The second thing to now work on is to go to the camera options in the menu. And as you can see, there are quite a few angles to choose from. And look, I get that some people like using the Helicam or the Hi-Cam, but this just makes the game look like Micro Machines more than a Need for Speed title. You could use Roof Cam, however, Low Cam is better in my opinion for one simple reason. Like in Trackmania or Gran Turismo, Low fixes the camera to the car itself. This actually makes the car a lot easier to drive because now the camera shows you where the car is actually pointing rather than the camera looking like it's being towed in an invisible trailer. Another bonus is that if you're one of those people that like using the Helicam or Hi-Cam to see more of the road, ironically the Low Cam is higher than Roof Cam and shows more of the track than the Roof Cam. And if you find the camera is still too close to the car, then instead of pulling the camera way up into the sky, just use the wider field of vision option instead. The new modern patch has also added an even wider view that not only increases the FOV even further than what was possible before, but it also improves the game's sense of speed now that not everything is so zoomed in. The Low Cam on its own is why I prefer Need for Speed 3 over High Stakes or Road Challenge. I have no idea why they removed that camera option in these future titles. There's a few more things to improve the visuals, such as making sure anisotropic filtering is set to 16 times in your video driver settings, and to also enable FXAA. You can use multi-sampling or super sampling, anti-aliasing, or MSAA or SSAA respectively, but unfortunately outside of glide mode and on modern hardware, the edges of trees and other textures with transparent capabilities will result in weird borders on the edges of said textures. SSAA and MSAA will actually make them more visible in some cases, which is why I recommend FXAA. Also, running the game at a much higher resolution, like 1080p or above, which is now enabled thanks to the modern patch, will also help hide these anomalies even more effectively. I know everyone thinks FXAA sucks, but it only sucks when compared to other methods of anti-aliasing in more modern games, where there's tons of detail that FXAA isn't really the best at handling. But it is more than capable of offering a smooth experience on a simpler looking game from 1998. And that's pretty much it. But learning from my last tutorial video, I just want to point out that I'm not an authority on Need for Speed 3. The point of this video is simply to bring some info to newcomers that don't know about this stuff. If you like the Helicam or Hi-Cam and your Amiga-esque HUD, then, well, those options are there for people that like it. But that doesn't mean I can't share my opinion on the matter. Until next time.